Welcome to today's Explainer. Have you ever just hit a wall? Like you're completely exhausted by modern life, even though, on paper at least, we supposedly have it better than any previous generation. Well, today we are unraveling a deeply philosophical and, frankly, a pretty fascinating historical mystery. We're looking at a diagnosis of modern society's hidden sickness, specifically by examining South Korea's insanely rapid cultural evolution. The source text we're diving into today presents a really unique perspective on why, despite massive economic growth and world-class infrastructure, so many people just find themselves exhausted, lost, and fundamentally unwell. We're going to explore how the very systems we rely on every single day might actually be at the root of this massive societal burnout.
So it all starts with this big, central, highly provocative question. Really think about this for a second. Why are modern citizens constantly struggling and burning out, despite living in an era of unprecedented education and infrastructure? The text points out that we literally have access to more knowledge and better facilities than any generation in human history. It's not even close. Yet when people graduate and enter society, they inevitably hit a wall. Instead of thriving, so many of us end up feeling completely broken. The speaker's argument here is that this isn't just some personal failure, it's a systemic, cultural phenomenon that we have completely misunderstood.
The source points out this rather tragic pipeline in modern society. We basically start at step one, entering society fully equipped with our formal education. We're ready to go, right? But then comes step two, where individuals, and the text particularly notes the baby boomer generation here, spend about 12 years struggling in absolute silence. Spouses suppress their frustrations, workers swallow their hardships. They're just letting all that immense pressure build up inside. And naturally, this leads to step three, where people inevitably break down and become what the speaker actually terms a patient. Their faces lose color, their energy drains, and they become physically or spiritually sick simply because they cannot process the crushing difficulties of their lives.
Moving into Section 2, Korea, the Absorber of Human Culture. Subtitle, The Post-WW2 Cultural Sponge.
Following the sheer devastation of World War II and the Korean War, the country was essentially a blank slate. To survive absolute grinding poverty, and remember, Korea was once poorer than many developing nations, the country had to act like a massive cultural sponge. The speaker impartially details how literally every foundational system we use today was imported. Our political culture? Imported democracy. Labor? Imported corporate structures. Even global faith systems, Western medicine, and social welfare practices were all completely absorbed from the outside world. The text argues that absolutely none of these were organically developed from within during this era. They were brought in wholesale simply because the immediate, desperate goal was national survival.
Now, the text specifically highlights that this massive influx wasn't just some accident. It was heavily driven by immense foreign aid and intervention, particularly from the United States. Foreign missionaries and international organizations built schools at a rate completely unseen in human history. On top of that, they established absolute religious freedom, insisting that religious institutions operate entirely without taxation or state interference. The speaker actually notes this was an unprecedented historical anomaly. It was a deeply unusual setup that allowed these institutions to grow massively and rapidly with basically zero oversight.
All right, Section 3. The true meaning of schools and religions, understanding the pillars of society. Here is where the source really redefines the actual purpose of these two major pillars. According to the text, schools are defined strictly as institutions designed to gather and efficiently distribute that foundational, imported global knowledge. The government gathered this knowledge and taught it to the youth just to help them function in the new world. On the flip side, religions are framed not merely as places of faith, but as ultimate societal refuges. Remember those broken patients we talked about earlier? The text argues that when life becomes overwhelmingly difficult and people break down after a decade in the real world, churches and temples are exactly where society's exhausted, sick citizens go to cope.
And the speaker actually maps out a highly specific progression for this societal sickness. When you first hit that wall of exhaustion, you become a general patient in phase 1. You haven't broken your body entirely yet, so you seek spiritual relief. You go to a pastor, a priest, or a monk, basically hoping to find answers to your life's crushing hardships. But if those underlying life problems aren't resolved and the window for personal effort closes, you degrade into phase 2, a critical patient. This is when your physical health completely fails and you're forced to go to hospitals and medical specialists to treat the biological symptoms of those unresolved life struggles.
But here's a pretty sharp, critical observation from the text about what actually happens in phase 1. The speaker argues that religious organizations are currently failing their true purpose.
Instead of deeply researching the underlying reasons for human suffering, like why is someone's family falling apart, or why did their business suddenly fail, these institutions have become what the speaker calls mere bowing centers. Think about the irony here for a second. Your life is literally falling apart, and the solution being offered is just escalating rituals. First they might ask for 3 bows, then maybe 108 bows, and eventually they might demand 3,000 bows for salvation. The source points out that this merely kills time. It offers a temporary band-aid without ever solving the root cause of the congregants' real-world struggles.
Which brings us to Section 4, the fatal limit of 30% knowledge, the core misunderstanding of modern education.
Okay, this right here is absolutely crucial. This is the core thesis of the entire explainer. Formal schooling only provides us with 30% of what we actually need to navigate life. That 30% slice, that's just the foundational, imported knowledge. But look at the rest. There is a massive, gaping 70% void. That empty space represents the missing research, the deeper human understanding, and the cultural evolution that we are theoretically supposed to develop ourselves but have completely neglected.
It's really important to define exactly what this 30% knowledge is. It's the foundational facts, the rote memorization, and those imported global systems taught in schools. Society mistakenly believes that graduating and acquiring this 30% is the finish line of the learning journey. But the speaker vehemently asserts that trying to survive a deeply complex, modern life equipped with only this basic 30% toolkit is exactly why so many of us inevitably hit a wall. It's why we become those broken patients after just a decade in the real world.
To put this into perspective and illustrate what happens when we ignore that 70% void, the source uses a great example: social welfare. If we blindly apply imported welfare systems, like simply handing out bread or money to someone without actually researching why they're poor in the first place, it paradoxically causes societal dysfunction. The text argues that unresearched charity just conditions the recipient to demand more, and when those handouts eventually stop, they turn their backs, they feel resentful, and they might even curse the very person who helped them. Without deep research into human struggles, even our best intentions structurally fail.
Let's pivot to the solution in Section 5, Opening the Future, Cultural Business, the Path to Healing Society.
So how exactly do we fix this? Well, the speaker frames the solution with this incredibly powerful statement. They argue the materials were brought in so we could research them and see if this is how we should live in the future. All that global culture, all those complex systems Korea absorbed post-war, the text insists they were never brought in just for passive, mindless consumption. They were raw materials. They were given to society specifically to be analyzed, heavily questioned, and deeply researched.
And that leads us to the concept of cultural business. The text clearly defines this as the absolute vital next step for a mature society. It's the active process of researching, refining, and evolving all those absorbed global cultures to solve deeper, uniquely human struggles. It means not just blindly practicing a religion, but rigorously researching why people suffer. It means not just showing up for labor, but researching the true cultural purpose of a corporation. It demands active evolution rather than just passive participation.
Think about it like this. In the past, the strategy was purely about survival. Society acted as a sponge, blindly absorbing and consuming global knowledge just to stay alive and build a basic infrastructure. But the future, according to the source, requires us to actively engage in cultural business. We absolutely have to process that foundational knowledge, fill in that missing 70% void through rigorous domestic research, and create entirely new paradigms that can actually heal society's exhausted patients.
And the ultimate goal of all this cultural business? The text calls it the culture of justice. True societal fairness, the speaker argues, cannot simply be an imported concept copied from a foreign textbook. It has to be established based on deep internal research into the specific lives, struggles, and real needs of the people.
Actually, the source highlights a really specific, kind of ironic anecdote to drive this point home. The speaker notes how deeply absurd it is that Korean society was completely swept up in trying to find the meaning of justice by obsessively reading foreign books, specifically calling out Harvard professor Michael Sandel's famous book, Justice. The speaker's entire point here is that it's highly ironic for a society to still look outward, heavily relying on foreign institutions to define fairness for them, instead of doing the hard, necessary work of researching and defining what justice actually means internally for its own people.
Which leaves us with this final, pretty provocative question to consider based on today's source material. Are we going to remain content just passively consuming the basic 30% culture we absorb just to survive? Or are we finally ready to do the hard research, fill that 70% void, and truly create a culture of justice that heals society from the inside out? It's an absolutely fascinating challenge to how we view our education, our religions, and our own societal evolution. Thanks so much for joining me on this explainer, and I really hope this deep dive gives you something profound to think about today.